Welcome to Innerji, Yoga and Wellbeing for Modern Life, for every body, every person. Hi, I'm Leslie Levy. And if you haven't listened before, this is an audio cast where I explore many different topics on yoga, well-being, life, just exploration. So I hope you will join me in today's audio cast. And today, we're well and truly into autumn here in the Southern Hemisphere. And it got me thinking about transitions, because autumn is a season of transition where we move from the dynamic energy and the movement of summer into the stillness and the hibernation of winter, that time of going within. And so autumn as a transition period is about, in some ways, slowing down. There's a bit of a push-pull to it, I find, that there's still that part of me that wants to hold on to those last remnants of the energy of summer. And then there's this other part of me who's ready to go within for that stillness that winter brings. And so I find those transition seasons of autumn and spring to be a little bit up and down at times. I don't know if you've noticed that as well, that as we transition from one season into another, we get this little push-pull thing happening. And so it's a time for reflection as well, I think, in that regard, about who we are and how we feel as we transition through autumn, from summer to winter, and what that might mean for you. And then it got me thinking about other types of transitions, the transitions in other cycles of our lives, the transition from babyhood to toddler, from being 100% dependent to starting to find our own little bits of independence. Anyone who's a mum knows that word no that comes around the terrible two period. I'm not a mum, but my gosh, I've seen it so many times with other mums as part of that growth, that development of the person, the personality. And then we have the transition from toddler to child, where more independence, more questions, more thoughts, more development come along. And then the transition from child to teenager, the time of puberty, the time of maturation in all sorts of ways. And then we become the adult. We transition into adulthood. We transition into perhaps motherhood, or nurturing in other ways as women. We transition into the prime of our lives, so they say. Although I kind of dispute that. I think the prime of our lives happen at different periods. I think there are prime moments in every cycle of our life as we transition from one aspect to another. And then there are the crone years, the years of the wise woman. Hopefully by the time I am further into my crone years, there'll be a little bit more wisdom around from myself that I can share. And then that led me to think about my yoga practice. You know, how do we move from one pose into another? Well, that's a transition, just like we transition through the seasons. And perhaps sometimes we get so caught up in getting into that next pose. You know, for example, in sun salutation, moving from that forward fold to step back into plank and lie down as quickly as possible in chaturanga onto our mat. But it's important to take time to think of those transitions. The transitions are just as important as holding the pose itself. And that applies to life as well. The transitions that we see in life are just as important, because they're the gateways. They're the pathways of moving from something to something else, whatever that may be. And so I encourage you this autumn, if you're doing yoga, if you're meditating, cooking, doing housework, working, whatever it is, perhaps take a moment to think about, what is transition for you in this task, in this job? What is the transition of your yoga pose? What is the transition from the everyday monkey mind thinking into the deep state of meditation? Transition, it's an interesting word. And particularly for me, when I come to autumn and spring, I do focus on transitions. And I encourage you to focus on transitions as well, just to see what that might mean for you in many different ways. We live in a society where we go from A to B, but really our lives are more like meandering rivers. They ebb, they flow. There are turbulent times. There are times when the river runs smoothly. There are times when the river is murky and when the river is clear. And each of those changes that you see in a river, they're all transitions. So perhaps you might like to think about the transitions of your life and see where those transitions have led you, perhaps in making different decisions. A little something to think about for autumn. Namaste. If you would like to know more about Innerji, you can visit my website at www.innerji.com.au. Until next time.